Good evening, everybody, and a very wet welcome, if I can call it that, to the NRF. In spite of the hail and the rain, it's really pleasing to see all of you joining us physically here at the NRF. We know this format is a format that is not necessarily one that's commonly used, where we have a physical lecture with a listenership that is far greater out there today. And so this NRF Science for Society lecture series is our attempt at engaging science and society. The communities out there, our listenership, physical audiences like yourself, have an opportunity to engage with the expertise, which we find sitting here, Dr. Carter Brown and Professor van Niekerk, and both of them ably qualified to speak to their particular fields. You know, the issue of energy, because people say, well, how do you get to choose your topics? I don't know that we could have chosen a more topical topic than the issue of energy right now. In the mornings, on the radio, going home in the afternoon, pick up the newspaper in the mornings, the end of the days, or actually experience the darkness at times. And it's really an issue that we are all involved in or affected by. And in the thinking of the NRF, which supports and promotes research, especially through high-end instruments like South African Research Chairs Initiative and the Centers of Excellence, we use this platform to make available that scientific expertise through our rated researchers, which are internationally renowned in terms of their rating categories, and others who are close to the system or close to the field of study, and give us the opportunity to engage. So we are really very excited about this. Usually we hold these lectures at universities, because this is actually a partnership with the universities. The last one we held late last year was at the University of Western Cape on human development, and it centered quite largely on early childhood education. We also had many at University of Johannesburg, Witwatersrand, and a very good one on customary law and Labola at University of KwaZulu-Natal. And you really are surprised by the call-in, by the amount of feedback, and by the media uptake after these interesting conversations. So this is just my thanks to you from us as the NRF for engaging with us, for being present here today, but also to the scientists themselves for actually being part of this discussion. I have no doubt, given the topic, it's going to be a lively conversation tonight. Thank you very much.
We're broadcasting live from the National Research Foundation's Science for Society lecture at the Chief Albert Luthuli Auditorium of the NRF in Pretoria. And let's start off with hearing from our first speaker, Professor Wikus van Niekerk, is the professor in the Department of Mechanical and Mechatronic Engineering and Director of the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies at Stellenbosch University. He has a keen interest in solar and ocean energy and is investigating the exploitation of wave energy along the southwest coast and ocean current energy of the east coast of South Africa. Professor van Niekerk serves on the boards of various organizations and companies and founded GeoSun Africa and SLR-SA as a spin-out commercial ventures from his research and consulting activities. He's received numerous awards throughout the years, the most recent being for his contribution to renewable energy in South Africa, particularly in the field of solar energy. Our audience, please do give the professor a warm round of applause.
All right. Thank you very much, Naledi. It's very important for me that when I'm here at the NRF that I first just acknowledge the sponsors of our center, which is the Department of Science and Technology through a program run by the National Research Foundation. And we're also sponsored by ESCOM, where we are designated the Specialization Center in Renewable Energy of the ESCOM Power Plant Engineering Institute. What I'm going to do in this talk is I'm first going to have a bit of a more general talk about and try to give you an idea of the background of the South African electricity landscape, Some recent developments and debates, which I think most of you are quite aware because it's been in the news, and it was just in the news a few minutes ago as well. And then I'm going to delve a little bit into renewable energy resources and projects before Clinton's going to take over and talk more about the IPP procurement programs and the other IPP programs that might be in the pipeline for us. You have to, energy is a very complex area that is highly regulated, and you really have to understand the role of the different regulators and entities inside this environment to know what's really happening. So you have the Department of Energy. They basically set the policy for electricity, also for liquid fuels and gas and other aspects. But specifically for electricity, they are the custodians of the integrated resource plan, and that plan basically determines what kind of power stations we will build in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. And that's a very important document that is normally approved by Cabinet, and that guides the procurement of electricity or let's call them power plants in the future. Then we have the National Energy Regulator of South Africa. They are actually implementers of this IRP or the Integrated Resource Plan, and one way they do that is by actually issuing the generating licenses to the power stations that want to come onto the national grid. But more importantly, they actually set the price for electricity, both wholesale, in other words, what Eskom can charge municipalities, farmers, industry for electricity, but also on the retail level, what municipalities can charge their own customers directly. So the national is quite important from a regulating point of view and implementing the policy of the Department of Energy. Then, of course, we all know about our national utility, Eskom, which is a state-owned enterprise, normally run by the Department of Public Enterprises, but now under the supervision of the Deputy President and the National Treasury. They are responsible for generation. They have a lot of generation online, the transmission and the distribution of electricity. They generate about 95% of the electricity in South Africa. About 85% of that comes from coal-fired power stations. And then somebody that we shouldn't forget is the Department of Environmental Affairs. They play two important roles in the electricity landscape. Firstly, they set the environmental legislation to which power stations must adhere, and also if you want to build a new power station, you have to do an environmental impact assessment that runs through that department. And then also, they have been driving the climate change or the response to climate change in South Africa quite aggressively, and there are some things that they have done in the past that have opened up some space for renewable energy in South Africa. We know that Eskom has a lot of coal-fired power stations. They have a small number of hydroelectricity plants, only about 600 megawatts, 35 gigawatts of coal-fired power stations. They've got pump storage, about 1.4 gigawatts, and they're building in Gula right now. They've got the so-called gas turbines or open cycle gas turbines that burn diesel, about 2.4. We've got Kuberg. And they also now have 100 megawatt of wind online in the Cerro wind farm. That gives about at the moment, about 42 gigawatts of generation on Eskom. And currently online, we have about 600 megawatts additional of photovoltaics as part of the IPP program. Sorry, that's wind is 600 megawatts and about 1 gigawatt of PV. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the presentation. Most of the generation happens in Mpumalanga on the coal mine, some now in Limpopo. Kuberg is down in Cape Town. So we have these long transmission lines that we have to distribute the electricity from up north down to the south. And then, of course, we have the solar energy coming in the Northern Cape and the wind coming in the Southern Cape and the Eastern Cape, and also actually in the Northern Cape. And then in the future, there might be some biomass production along the coast of KwaZulu-Natal. One thing that's quite interesting is you start looking at some data is what has happened to the generation of electricity over the last few years. And if you know what the numbers say, the number of, or the amount of electricity that we've generated for the last 5 or 8 years have not increased. It's actually stayed very stable at typically around 250 terawatt hours. There are a number of reasons for that. One reason is that there was an economic downturn in 2008, and you can actually see that in the graph because we used actually less electricity in the next few years. There was a lot of demand-side management that happened, and there was a reduction in the requirements from companies, and you know about the rollout of CFLs and solar water heaters that have helped that. But then another big constraint on this is that Eskom couldn't generate more electricity to put on the grid, and that was another reason why this demand curve stayed well below all the different projections. And remember that number, about 250 terawatt hours, is all the electricity that we use in a country in a year. One other thing that's quite important is that Eskom has many old power stations. Most of the power stations are 30 years or older, and these power stations are going to be decommissioned in the next 10 to 20 years. So not only do we have to have new generation come online to cater for an increased demand in electricity to grow the economy, but we have to replace this. And it's very, very important that the decisions for these new generations should be made yesterday. Not today, not tomorrow, yesterday. We are running well behind schedule and making some very important generation decisions. Then, of course, we know that Eskom has some significant technical challenges. There was a turbine in Duva that blew up in 2011. That unit is back online, it's unit 3. And last year, Duva number 4, right next to it, blew a boiler. That boiler is still not even being fixed. And then, of course, we all know that late last year, we had a whole coal silo collapse at Majuba that basically took that whole power station off the grid. These are significant accidents. A utility would expect to have maybe one of those in a decade. We had 3 of those in a couple of years. So these are significant accidents, industrial accidents as well. Another very bleak picture in Eskom is the economic situation, and we've just heard now what happened with the credit rating. But if you look at some of the numbers, that there was a 31% increase in the cost, in their cost, from the March 12 to the March 13 financial year, and again last year there was a 10% increase. And remember, during that time, they didn't sell more electricity. They sold exactly the same electricity, and the increases they got was well below these numbers. So you're looking at the utility that really is in a dire financial straits at the moment. And typically, depending on how you do the numbers, one can argue that maybe it costs 60 cents a kilowatt hour to generate electricity, or for Eskom to generate electricity. And then, of course, some of the things that happened a couple of weeks ago when some of the key and most senior people were suspended while there is an investigation going on at Eskom. So suffice to say that Eskom is in a dire situation, and I think what's very important that we should recognize, if Eskom is in a dire situation, South Africa is in a dire situation. We have a big, big crisis, and it's a national crisis. It's not an Eskom crisis. It's a national crisis, and it's something that needs to be addressed very, very quickly. Then there are some very interesting debates that have been going on for a number of years now. The first is the so-called nuclear versus renewable energy and gas debate. This debate started with the National Planning Commission, which stated in the National Development Plan quite categorically that the National Planning Commission support a future electricity generation based on renewable energy and gas. And that is preferable to a nuclear plant. On the other hand, you have the Department of Energy and our President, who seems to be very, very eager to build 9.6 gigawatts of nuclear power stations. So that is a very interesting debate, and maybe we're going to go into that debate a little bit more tonight. All I want to put in early into this nuclear debate is the cost of nuclear is always unclear. The latest cost figure that's in the public domain was a deal that was struck last year between Arriva and the United Kingdom, and there the cost of electricity comes out to about R1.80 a kilowatt hour. But there's another issue with nuclear. It's quite possible to get a company like Rosatom to bring the technology to South Africa. In fact, the Russian government will fund that activity in South Africa, and in fact, the Rosatom will even build, operate, and maintain that power station. All they want from us is they want a long-term power purchase agreement, and they will happily run that power station for us. The cost is an issue. But there's another issue that we have to recognize, and that is that Rosatom will not take on the liability of that nuclear power station. They cannot get insurance for that nuclear power station. The only entity that can take on the liability of a nuclear power station is the government of the country. And the moment the South African government takes on that liability, the country's credit rating will go down. If the credit rating goes down, the interest rates goes up. So our balance of payment is not all that great. And that is a big financial issue that needs to be addressed. And then, of course, the last issue around nuclear is that we are a little bit concerned about the procurement. There seems to be a lot of secrecy around the procurement of the nuclear power plants for South Africa, and that is surely not a good sign. One thing that we were very happy was in 2011, when the 2010 IRP was launched, For the first time, there was a role for photovoltaics, solar, CSP, or concentrating solar power in wind. And it was the first time in South Africa that the government actively announced and procured renewable energy. And that program is recognized in the world as one of the models of how to procure electricity. And I'm going to have my colleague tell you more about that. Now, let's look a little bit at the sun. South Africa is blessed with countries like Chile, Australia, North America, Mexico, with some of the best solar irradiance. In fact, it's a bit of a race between Chile and the Northern Cape, who has the highest, what we call DNI, or direct normal irradiance. At the moment, the Chileans are a little bit ahead of us. So we want to find a spot in South Africa where maybe we can beat them again. To put that a little bit in perspective, in South Africa, we have 50% more solar energy, or direct normal irradiance, than what they have in Spain, where they have built a number of solar power stations. We have 20% more than the United States of America, where they also build a lot. In fact, remember I said you must remember the number 250 terawatt hours. If we want to generate electricity from the sun, right, and we want to generate over a year 250 terawatt hours using solar PV panels or mirrors to collect the energy, doesn't matter what technology. The approximate area that we have to cover with these collectors is about 40 by 40 kilometers. It's really a very, very small part of the country that we need to cover with solar collectors, and we will generate all the electricity that we need. Of course, we will never do that, because what happens when the sun goes down or when the cloud passes over Uppington, we won't do that. But it just illustrates to us how blessed we are with solar energy. I'm going to start talking about what we call CSP, or concentrated solar power. This is a technology where we use the thermal energy in the sun's rays. We deflect it with mirrors onto receivers or receiver tubes, and we collect the thermal energy. And we use that thermal energy to generate steam. The steam turns a turbine, and we generate electricity in exactly the same way that a nuclear power station or coal-fired power station would generate electricity. However, the big benefit of CSP is that it is the only renewable energy, except of course for hydro, that has a proven storage system at scale with reasonable cost. Because what one can do is we can collect the solar thermal energy during the day, and we can store it in hot salt, molten salt, and at night when the sun goes down, we can actually then generate electricity. There is a power station in Spain called Gema Solar, 20 megawatt electricity. They have the record of 36 days continuous production at full capacity. Right? So it is possible to generate electricity 24 hours from the sun. It's not new technology. The oldest power stations were built in 1984, and they are still operational today. So it's not new technology. The largest plant that was currently in operation is the Solana plant, 250 megawatt electric in the US. This plant by itself generates nearly 1 terawatt hours of electricity, 980 gigawatt hours. It means 250 of these plants would generate our 250 terawatt hours. So it shows you also that technically this is possible. It will cost more, and that is the big challenge right now. We are building our own plants, and a couple of weeks ago, our first CSP plant went online, the Kaksu plant near Pofadder, and there are at least 4 other plants currently under construction. Then, of course, the other way that we can generate electricity is making use of photovoltaic systems, or PV panels, as they're sometimes called, or PV modules. This is also old technology. You can get a performance guarantee for 20 years on these things. There's very few things that I know in the world where you can buy from a supplier and they will give you a 20-year warranty on his product. You can get that on a PV model. The prices are declining, and this evening I actually heard people now saying 84 cents a kilowatt hour. That is a very, very attractive price. Rooftop PV is a very short-term win for South Africa right now. We can roll out rooftop PV very quickly. It will be privately funded by homeowners, factory owners, owners of malls. We just need to unblock some blockages in Eskom on the technical side, and we have to come up with just a reasonable tariff to make it possible for these to do it. I'll come back to the question about why PV as a fuel saver is so important for us right now. Wind technology, of course, is something that's well proven. It's been around forever, and in South Africa, we also now have a number of wind farms online. Most of the wind farms are in the Eastern Cape, but some of the other wind farms will be in the Northern Cape and also in the Karoo. It's established technology. Here is a Jeffreys Bay wind farm. They had two very unique characteristics at Jeffreys Bay wind farm. The one is that power plant came online exactly the date of the contract. So they were not 1 day early, they were not 1 day late. It came on exactly the date on the contracted date. And also they worked 1.5 million hours and there was no reportable accident or incident or injury at that power plant. So it really shows you when the private industry gets to build something, they do it quickly, they do it safely, and they do it in budget on time. Here is a graph, and unfortunately the viewers can't see it, but I'll explain it to you. I was very worried about why didn't we get load shed as much as we expected from January onwards. We actually had very little load shedding if we look at the situation in Eskom. And then last Friday we got some data from Eskom that shows how the photovoltaic plants are performing and adding to the grid. These plants have been consistently adding between 800 megawatt and 1 gigawatt to the grid in the middle of the day when we really, really needed it. And I will make the assertion that if it wasn't for these PV plants, we would have had a lot more load shedding. So renewable energy is already helping us reducing load shedding. What's more important is these photovoltaic plants are what we call fuel savers. Basically, they're going to save us diesel because we don't have to run the OCGTs in the middle of the day. They're going to save us water because we can leave the water in the dams at the top, and then we can use them because we need them in the evening when the sun is no longer shining. So PV has been a rescuer for South Africa in the last few months. Unfortunately, it becomes winter, and then it might change around. What's also quite interesting, if you look at some of the data, is how the wind always comes in the afternoons and actually work and blow right into the evenings. There's only 600 megawatts of wind online, but we expect that as more wind farms come on, the contribution for wind would actually smooth out. So at this point, I'm going to stop my lecture, and I'm going to give my colleague an opportunity to tell us more about the ITP program.
Now, Dr. Clinton Carter-Brown is the Technical Director of the Energy Unit at Oricon and the Head of Technical within the South African Independent Power Producer Office. He's supporting the procurement of electricity generation from the private sector. Dr. Clinton Carter-Brown, between 2008 and 2013, was a corporate specialist in the Planning Center of Excellence in Power Delivery Engineering in the Eskom Technology Group. And he was focused on the optimization and standardization of network planning practices. Send your SMSs to 34701. The audience, please do give the doctor a round of applause.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Naledi. You pronounced my name so beautifully. I could listen to you all night. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I really feel quite privileged and honored, and especially following Wikus, he really makes my life very easy in terms of telling you, which is probably one of South Africa's best kept secrets, and that really is the Independent Power Producers Program, an eminently internationally respected procurement program developed and implemented in South Africa by South Africans, and I think it's something that we can all be extremely proud of. And in terms of the lecture portion of tonight's discussion, I'm really going to focus on the role that independent power producers can play in the energy mix. I'm going to take you through some of the successes to date, so that in the future, regardless of whatever energy is decided to be procured, to just inform the public and of course the audience in terms of what we have already done and what we can do going forward. Now, as Prof. Niekerk has said, our present generation constraints are severe and extremely debilitating. We cannot allow Eskom to fail, and the consequences of such failure would be extremely dire. Now, independent power producers is essentially a private-owned power generating plant. So you have a private entity that is set up normally for the sole purposes of generating electricity that it then sells to the national grid, where that grid then delivers that energy to end consumers or loads that then consume that energy. Now, IPPs, in partnership with Eskom, provide a sustainable and complementary solution to our electricity generation requirements. The introduction of private sector electricity generation in South Africa is complementary to Eskom, and it offers multiple benefits. Firstly, it allows us to diversify both the supply and nature of energy production. We come from a largely coal and nuclear-based fleet with a limited amount of hydro pump storage, and progressing forward we need to diversify that energy mix from an energy security perspective as well as an economic and financial sustainability perspective to include all sources of energy, whether they be the likes of wind, solar and wave. We need to introduce new skills into the industry. And the other thing that IPPs allow us to do is to transparently benchmark the performance and the pricing of new generation. And I'll be sharing some quite staggering statistics with that, around that with you. Now, a significant share of South Africa's electricity generation is already procured by independent power producers. I really alluded to the fact that it really is one of our best kept secrets. Now, this required a framework for the procurement of electricity whereby IPPs sell power to Eskom. And we already have a world-class IPP procurement program, the results of which have saved South Africa money and reduced load shedding. And we'll touch on some of those specifics in a bit more detail later. Now, the IPP procurement is being driven by the IPP Office. And the IPP Office essentially exists as a formation existing under the Department of Energy, the Department of National Treasury, and the Development Bank of South Africa. And the IPP Office really exists to materially do two things. Firstly, to manage the commercial process for the award of contracts to secure long-term power purchase agreements with IPPs. And secondly, to manage the ongoing management of those contracts. And it's doing it in two main generation areas. The first is in the renewable space, where we've been procuring a range of onshore wind, solar voltaics, concentrated solar power, small hydro, biomass, biogas, landfill gas. We also have a small renewables IPP program, and with developments in the space of hydro, and also cogeneration using agricultural waste products. In parallel with that, and I'll be touching on that more as well, we have been developing the non-renewable energy procurement programs for IPPs in the fields of coal, cogeneration, and gas. Now, to date, the IPP Office, with the support of the major stakeholders, as I said, Department of Energy, Treasury, and DBSA, have to date procured contracts for 4.2 gigawatts of renewable energy. Of that, 1.5 gigawatts is already commissioned and in full commercial operation. And we have a mandate to procure essentially 6.9 gigawatts through a ministerial determination. That then aligns with the broader integrated resource plan and national development plan target of 17.8 gigawatts by 2013. So this is a large amount of power and a very significant share of our overall generation mix. Now, the IPP procurement has been designed with a rolling bid window program format. And what that means is that we run, typically within the renewable program, an annual process whereby we release the commercial documentation. IPPs then bid fixed prices into a very transparent, open commercial tendering process. Those bids are then evaluated in a very strict and controlled manner, and the winning bidders are then adjudicated based on a combination of price and social economic development objectives, and are then awarded long-term PPAs. We've done that for a number of cycles, as we will show, and we learn with every cycle. Now, why do we do that? Firstly, by running a number of bid windows, it attracts continued market interest, and it induces increased competitive pressure amongst bidders to offer reduced pricing. It allows for improvements and lessons learned from each bid window to be incorporated in the refinement of procurement documentation in the following bid windows. And it allows us to use standard contracts and avoid negotiations and enables consistency. Now, the design of the program aligns with the National Development Plan to set in motion a virtuous cycle of development growth by recognizing the interdependency between the desired Vision 2030 outcomes and the socio-economic commitments made by the IPPs in relation to a range of factors. These include job creation and skills development, economic interest participation by previously disadvantaged persons in local communities, localized spend and procurement, as well as the general improvement of the lives of people, for example, through access to health and education. And I must pause at this point and say that the IPPs to date have made a meaningful contribution in the lives of several communities in which they are located. Now, it's very important that we understand that when we procure our own IPP procurement program, we are not procuring power stations, we are procuring electricity. And there is a massive, massive difference that I don't believe is truly appreciated. An IPP determines the plant location and design, and they sit with the associated risks. So we're from an IPP procurement, we don't specify that you need to use a certain type of equipment or the design of that equipment. That is the engine room and is the business of the IPP developer, and they do that best. We're there to procure the output of that plant, which is the electricity. So they determine how the plant is designed, constructed, and operated. They also manage the risks of delays and cost overruns, as any delays would directly impact on their financial viability, and they feel the pain of any delays or costs. The IPP only gets paid for electricity that is generated, which is a wonderful efficiency driver and ensures delivery. And the tariff paid to the IPP is fixed and firm for the duration of the power purchase agreement. Presently it's indexed at Consumer Price Index, and which essentially shields the consumer from any price increases. In terms of the Renewable ITP Program to date, we've had 5 bid windows. This started with the first bid window, design and procurement, in 2011. And since that, in a very short period of time, we've procured 4,122 megawatts, which is contracted from 66 renewable energy projects, half of them being wind and more than 35% PV. And we're expecting the bid window 4 announcement to be made shortly, whereby an additional allocation will be contracted. In terms of some of the key facts, or some of the outcomes of our program to date, and this is essentially what was generated in the last calendar year, it was 2,221 gigawatt hours. I mean, that's 2.2 terawatt hours, which essentially is 221 million kilowatt hours. So it's a lot of energy, of which roughly 52% was generated by PV. And of all that energy, about 15% was actually generated during evening and morning peak periods. Now, the generation of that clean renewable energy then saved the production of approximately 2.3 million tons of CO2 that would have otherwise been caused by coal-fired power stations. And that has come to a cost in terms of payments to IPPs amounting to 4.6 billion rand. But the good news is that while we paid them 4.6 billion rand, work done recently within the CSIR has estimated the direct savings in coal, diesel, as well as the economic benefits of reduced load shedding, saved the South African economy real money to the tune of at least 800 million rand last year. Furthermore, the 2.2 terawatt hours is roughly sufficient to supply electricity to about 0.7 million South African households. And just in the first 32 IPPs that are operational, the construction phases of those projects created more than 16,000 job years. The really fantastic news as well is in terms of what has happened to the prices, which is in stark contrast to what we've seen in some other build programs, such as Eskom's Medupi project. The first bid window 1 resulted in an average renewable price of R2.15 per kilowatt hour. 1 year later in bid window 2, that reduced by 34% to R1.42, and by bid window 3 had dropped a staggering further 19% to R1.14. That means a halving of renewable energy prices in just 3 years, a truly remarkable achievement, and testimony to the results of what can be achieved by the private sector when participating in a fiercely competitive, open and transparent commercial process. If we look at what this meant for some of the prices of the individual technologies, solar PV in particular has dropped dramatically, wind less so, but also wonderfully, and even CSP is showing encouraging trends in terms of cost reduction. think it's important to note that CSP is more expensive than the other renewables, primarily because of the storage component allowing it to generate during evening peaks, which is an added advantage to our system. In terms of the investment, our present 4 bid windows have an estimated total project cost of just over 145 billion rand, and of that, almost 46 billion rand is local content, so that is equipment that is sourced and provided locally in South Africa. The Renewable Energy IPP Program is also making a significant contribution to local development in the form of socio-economic development to the tune of 9.8 billion rand, 2.6 billion rand in enterprise development, more than 60,000 job years in jobs in terms of employment during the construction phases of these projects, and very importantly, through the creation of local trusts, the communities in these areas are also expected to benefit to the tune of 26 billion rand over the lifetime of these projects. So this is more than just generating electricity, it's also about socio-economic development, which the private sector is then obviously playing a key role in. In terms of the lessons learned from the IPP program, well, first and foremost, that IPPs can play a meaningful role in the electricity generation. That it's possible to implement an effective procurement program in a short period of time that is able to promote access to the private sector investment. That the rolling IPP procurement program has been effective to drive down tariffs in the form of wind, PV and CSP through a fiercely competitive and transparent bidding process. That also allows the implementation of lessons between the various bid windows. As Prof van Niekerk showed, South Africa has an abundant solar and wind resources. However, the grid is continuing to become problematic as low-hanging fruits are taken up, and we are fast running out of grid capacity in certain parts of the country, specifically where we have the best sun and wind. Renewable energy projects also have short lead times, and as we've seen, are typically produced on time and certainly within budget. Renewable energy is cost competitive and has to play a key role in the future energy mix. But the IPP Office is more than just renewable energy. As per the May 2011 DOZ Gazetted New Generation Regulations under the Electricity Regulation Act, the Minister has also provided determination for the IPP Office to procure 2.5 gigawatts of baseload coal-fired power stations, 800 megawatts of thermal cogeneration plant, and 3,126 megawatts of gas-fired power plants. And the IPP baseload coal program was released in December last year and also follows the successful bid window approach implemented in the renewables program. Cogeneration and gas programs are currently under development and are due to be released shortly. In terms of the way forward, as I mentioned, IPPs can and should form an important role in the South African generation mix. Accelerated IPP renewables energy procurement is a no-regret option that can make a meaningful short-term contribution to our energy crisis, whilst aligning with the long-term sustainability objectives. South Africa is very fortunate to have a world-class, and I do mean world-class, IPP procurement program that is considered to be a benchmark for public and private enterprise partnership. I must stress that Eskom is a key partner, and IPPs must complement Eskom's build program and operations. We cannot do this without Eskom, and in terms of our IPP programs, Eskom is the buyer, and we work and integrate very, very closely with Eskom. IPPs should be part of the implementation strategy for the country's generation plans, as is informed by our national policy that's set by the Department of Energy. And generation planning obviously needs to reflect the learnings from our successful IPP procurement programs. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time.